Hey there. Welcome back. If you love stories that unfold slowly, that breathe, that make you feel something, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and tap that like button. It helps more than you know, and it keeps these kinds of stories alive. Now, tonight, we're not starting with noise. No fireworks, no headlines, no heroes in marble. We're starting with a quiet man in a second-hand coat, walking into a room that smells like coffee and rain and changing people. Not with power, but with permission. This is the story of Edward Ralston, the man who didn't claim to fix anyone, only to remind them who they were before the world made them forget. Welcome to today's episode, The Soft-Spoken Prophet.
He didn't stand on a stage like a preacher. He didn't shout. He didn't demand belief. Edward Ralston entered rooms like he already belonged there, not with arrogance, but with certainty, the kind that makes you wonder what he knows that you don't. People said when he looked at you, it felt like being remembered, as if he'd met you before in some better version of your life. In the dust and despair of the 1930s, when factories were shuttered and soup lines wound around the block, people didn't need another politician. They didn't need promises. They needed permission. Permission to imagine that what they felt inside, the ache, the longing, the unfinished story, might mean something. That it wasn't foolishness, that it was a kind of truth. And Ralston gave them that. He never wore a white coat, never claimed to be a doctor or a saint, just a man with a belief that inside every person is a second life, waiting. He called it the unremembered self, the part of you that knew joy before shame, that dreamed without apology, that saw the world not through trauma, but through wonder. He spoke softly, and people leaned in. His early talks weren't publicized. They happened in rented rooms above laundromats or in the back of churches between Sunday services, folding chairs, low light, nervous silence. And then Ralston would begin. No notes, no stagecraft, just a question. Who were you before the world taught you to doubt? And that silence would crack. Some wept, some stared, some laughed as if hearing a joke in a language they thought they'd forgotten. He didn't promise wealth. He didn't offer healing in the way people expected. He said, "You are not broken. You are buried. Beneath years of being told who you are, my job is not to fix you, it's to unearth you." And somehow, in that excavation, people changed. A mother who hadn't spoken since her son died began to sing again. A veteran who hadn't slept in years closed his eyes peacefully in the back of the room. A seamstress quit her job and started teaching music in her kitchen, saying, "I forgot I was allowed to love anything." Ralston wasn't a miracle worker. He was a mirror. And in that mirror, people saw the version of themselves they'd longed to believe in, but had never been allowed to trust. He didn't give people a dream. He reminded them they already had one. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous gift of all. Because once you remember the dream, you can't go back to sleep.
There was no prescription, no diagnosis, no clipboard, just a room and a man who asked questions no doctor ever had. Edward Ralston called it the dream cure, but there was no medicine involved, not in the traditional sense. No pills, no potions, only belief, rehearsed until it became real. It started with a single session in a dusty community center outside Chicago, a rainy Tuesday, 15 folding chairs, and the kind of overhead lighting that hums like it's trying to speak. No one knew what to expect. Ralston walked in carrying nothing but a chalkboard, not to teach, but to erase. "I'm not here to add something to your life," he said. "I'm here to help you remember what you buried to survive it." He invited them, no, dared them to name the version of themselves they'd long given up on. not a fantasy, not a celebrity, not a millionaire, something deeper, something buried but intact. He told them to close their eyes and picture a morning in that other life, the one they once imagined was waiting if everything just worked out. Then he asked the room to describe it. One man spoke, then another, then a woman in the back who hadn't spoken in years whispered, "In that life, I laugh when I wake up." And Ralston simply nodded. Then came the ritual. "You must act as if that life is already yours," he said, "not because it is, but because belief is the soil in which it might grow." He wasn't selling optimism, he was commanding presence. The dream cure wasn't wishful thinking, it was a rehearsal for a life not yet lived. He taught them to sit each morning in silence, place a hand on their chest, and speak to the person they wished to become. "I am you. I remember you. I am coming back." Word spread like wildfire on dry wind. People arrived in pain, chronic, emotional, unnameable, and they left with tears in their eyes, clutching old dreams like sacred texts. Ralston refused to charge money. Dreams, he said, should be the one thing we don't monetize. But still, others did. Pamphlets emerged, guides, unauthorized workbooks. Churches began referencing him in sermons. Reporters came, at first with curiosity, then skepticism, then hunger, the kind that turns prophets into spectacles. "Is this a cult?" some whispered. But Ralston refused the stage, refused the spotlight, refused the title of healer. He was always just Edward, a man with a question. What if your best self isn't lost, just waiting for you to believe in it? Edward Ralston never wore a stethoscope. He didn't need one. He listened differently, not for heartbeat, not for breath, but for the moment a voice wavered, the slight tremble that meant someone was speaking from the place they usually hide. He believed illness lived not only in the body, but in the stories we told ourselves about who we were allowed to be. And so, in quiet rooms lit by soft lamplight, he began to rewrite those stories, not with facts, with feeling. He called his method belief rehearsal. To outsiders, it looked like theater, but to those who participated, it felt like resurrection. A woman with tremors rehearsed what it felt like to be steady, not to pretend, but to remember. A man who hadn't hugged his own children in years practiced forgiveness aloud, repeating, "I was afraid. I am not afraid now." There were no scripts, no fixed protocols, only presence. Ralston would sit across from someone, hands in his lap, and ask the simplest, most disarming question: "What do you miss about yourself?" And that's when the work began. He taught them to speak to the lost self as if it were still listening, to say things like, "I remember when we weren't ashamed to want more. I miss how we used to laugh without asking permission. I'm sorry I abandoned you." And something shifted. People sat taller, breathed deeper, cried not from sadness, but from recognition. He said, "Your body listens to your voice, so speak to it with the love you wished you'd been given." Medical professionals scoffed. Psychologists debated him. He wasn't licensed, he wasn't trained, but he also wasn't trying to replace them. He was working in the spaces they couldn't reach, the quiet, private chambers of longing where logic doesn't live. In that space, Ralston didn't treat illness, he treated identity. He asked people to remember who they had been before the world insisted they shrink. And once someone touches that memory, really touches it, they don't go back. They can't. It's like learning to breathe again after years in shallow air. And for some, that was the most healing thing of all. Not a pill, not a diagnosis, just a moment of being seen, fully, without agenda. Ralston used to say, medicine restores the body, belief restores the soul. Both are necessary, but only one teaches you how to come home to yourself.
Fame doesn't knock. It seeps in, like fog under a door. And Ralston, despite his efforts, couldn't keep it out. By the mid-1940s, his name no longer belonged to him. It lived on brochures he hadn't approved, echoed in workshops he'd never taught, and spilled from the mouths of strangers who'd never sat with him, but claimed to channel his message. They called it dream alignment, echo sessions, the new belief. It was never his, but it wore his face. In cities he'd never visited, people paid to attend Ralston Method seminars, complete with choreography, branded journals, and exercises he never invented. And yet, when asked, he didn't rage, didn't sue, didn't warn people away. He only said, "Once an idea is born, it belongs to the ones who need it. I just hope they hear the silence between my words." But in private, he worried that his invitation to remember your deeper self had become just another commodity, a technique, a program, a way to sell hope in 12 easy steps. And worse, some began to treat him not as a teacher, but as a symbol. To the disillusioned, he was a fraud. To the desperate, a messiah. Neither was true, and both were dangerous. Ralston once wrote in his journal, "The more they see me, the less they hear what I meant." That line haunted him, because something profound had shifted. He was no longer a person, he was a projection. And in the carnival of human longing, projection is the first distortion. They printed his quotes on posters with gold foil. They spoke of him as if he could perform miracles. People didn't come to hear the questions anymore. They came for the feeling, the spectacle, the stage. They didn't want to work. They wanted to believe in him. And Ralston, the man who once reminded people to reclaim their power, began to fear he had accidentally taken it. He stepped back, refused speaking engagements, canceled appearances, stopped publishing altogether. But the movement didn't slow. It multiplied. It became a hall of mirrors, each reflection bending slightly, selling something slightly different, but all of it echoing his name. Ralston had always said, "I'm not the answer, I'm just the invitation." But too many people were done searching for answers. They just wanted something, someone to believe in. And so the dream, once fragile and personal, became public, noisy, distorted. It was no longer a whisper, it was an empire. And Ralston, he began to fade from view. He walked away, not with drama, not with a farewell tour, just absence. One day the lectures stopped, the letters went unanswered, the name Ralston began to drift from headlines to whispers. Some said he was burned out, others said he was ashamed, but those who knew him best said only this: he didn't want to become a myth, because myths are worshipped, but they're never questioned, and Ralston had always been about the questions. He left the stage, left the city, moved into a quiet cottage in Vermont with an overgrown garden and no phone line. And yet, the dream didn't die. It wandered. It survived. It showed up in unexpected places. A schoolteacher using belief rehearsal in detention rooms. A grief counselor inviting parents to speak to their lost children aloud.
a small-town librarian hosting dream circles in the basement twice a month. Ralston's words, once spoken in soft tones to small rooms, were now being reinterpreted, recycled, even misquoted, but always, somehow, remembered. He had planted something, and though he never intended to lead a movement, the soil he tilled was rich enough for others to grow their own. Strangers wrote to one another in forums and handwritten letters. "Have you tried the mirror method? I start each morning with his question. I don't believe in him, but I believe in what I felt." There was no church, no headquarters, no hierarchy, just a quiet spread like light at dawn. And though Ralston wasn't watching, the world was still listening. In his absence, the idea found freedom. Freed from his face, freed from his name, the dream cure evolved into something no one could quite define, but many could feel. Something private, something sacred, a kind of gentle rebellion against the hardness of the world. Ralston's cottage had no internet. He spent most days with dirt under his fingernails and books stacked on windowsills. But when a visitor came, rarely, quietly, he would always make tea. And sometimes they'd ask him, "Do you miss it?" And he would smile without answering. Because how do you miss something that never really left? For years he had stayed hidden. But dreams have a way of leaking through cracks, through time, through people who never meant to carry them but couldn't help it. By the late 1940s, the world had caught wind again. It started with a magazine article. A reporter digging through old lecture notes and radio transcriptions asked, "Whatever happened to the man who taught belief as medicine?" Then came the second wave. The article went viral by the standards of the time, picked up in France, translated in Brazil, discussed on late-night radio. They called him the lost prophet of the American soul. Producers came knocking, book agents, filmmakers, foundations. They offered money, fame, legacy. He turned them all down. "I won't sell the mirror," he said, "because the minute you mass-produce reflection, people stop looking at themselves and start looking at the packaging." But they kept coming. A network sent a film crew to his town. They waited outside the corner store, hoping to catch him on a grocery run. When he never appeared, they filmed the fog rolling across the hills and called it a portrait of mystery. The mystery sold. Some called him a recluse, others a fraud hiding from exposure. But the real story was quieter than either. Ralston wasn't hiding. He just no longer needed to be seen. His work, he said, had always been about the person sitting across from him, not the crowd. But the crowd didn't believe that, because the myth had grown too large. In the vacuum of his silence, the world had filled in its own versions of who he was. A genius, a coward, a visionary, a manipulator. He was all of them, and none of them. Because myths, like mirrors, only reflect the person standing in front of them. Ralston would read the articles. He'd smile at the exaggerations, shake his head at the fantasies, and then he'd go back to his garden, because the soil, at least, didn't need him to be anyone but himself. But the watchers never stopped watching. Even as he shrank from view, the movement, if it could even still be called that, spread. Not through cults, not through campaigns, but through quiet awakenings in ordinary lives. A woman in Kansas waking up and repeating, "I am still here." A boy in Manila drawing pictures of who he wanted to become. A widower in Naples teaching breathwork from a tattered pamphlet someone left behind. The world watched him, but he was watching something else. Not his name, not his story, but the way belief moved without him. not as a sermon, but as a whisper. It was bound to happen. Movements, no matter how gentle, eventually collide with the jagged edge of expectation. For years, Ralston's name had been protected by distance, by his absence, by the fog of time. But belief, when borrowed too freely, begins to tear. The letter arrived in spring, a single page, typed, unsigned. It came from someone who had once called him a lifeline. Now they called him something else. They said his methods had harmed them, that hope had turned into obsession, that the line between belief and delusion had blurred and Ralston had drawn it too thin. The accusation was not public, but it broke something in him. Because he had always said, "I am not here to save you, only to remind you that you are not lost." But now someone claimed they were worse for having known him. He didn't defend himself, not publicly, not privately. Instead, he wrote one final line in his notebook that day. "I forgot how easily dreams can become burdens." The letter became a whisper, the whisper a rumor, and the rumor a warning. Other letters followed, not many, but enough. Some questioned his intentions, others warned of emotional dependency. A few hinted at the word no one wanted to say, cult. It wasn't true, not in structure, not in form, but the scent of it was enough to scatter the flock. Institutes that bore his name quietly dissolved. Retreat centers canceled bookings. Donors withdrew. And just like that, the delicate web unraveled. He didn't run. He simply stopped answering. Even his most loyal students began to drift away, not in anger, but in confusion, in grief. Because when a dream cracks, it doesn't shatter all at once. It splinters. You still see your reflection, but now it's fractured, uneven, untrustworthy. Ralston withdrew even further. His garden grew wild, the mailbox filled with unanswered notes. The town said they hadn't seen him in weeks. Some thought he was sick, others ashamed. But one woman, a neighbor who brought him books each month, said it best. "He's not hiding, he's grieving, not for himself, for the dream." And maybe she was right, because Ralston had never sought power, only possibility. And now even that, the gentlest of hopes, had been turned against itself. The mirror he once offered now sat cracked in a darkened room. And outside, the watchers were still watching. But the light had gone out. Movements don't always end with fire. Sometimes they just go quiet. After the accusations, after the silence, after the slow decay of trust, what remained wasn't scandal, it was confusion. There was no final statement, no confession, no dramatic closure, just a fading presence and a question left behind. What now? Ralston's most devoted followers were scattered across states and countries, connected not by any formal structure, but by memory. Some turned bitter. "He abandoned us," they said. "He let the dream die." Others turned protective. They gathered in small homes, whispered his words like scripture, preserved yellowing lecture notes in plastic sleeves. They refused to believe he was anything but misunderstood. But most simply drifted back to their lives. They stopped attending dream circles, stopped journaling their future selves, stopped believing that belief alone could change them. And yet, the traces remained, in the way they comforted friends, in the language they used for grief, in the moments they caught themselves, hand on heart, whispering, "I'm still here." Even in ruin, Ralston's teachings had left fingerprints. but not everyone remembered them fondly. Articles emerged, academic and critical, framing the dream cure as spiritual bypassing, as pseudoscience, as a dangerous distraction from real healing. And in some cases, they weren't wrong. Because belief is powerful, but it is not always safe. Ralston underestimated that. He believed too much in the goodness of people, too much in the strength of self-discovery, and too little in the chaos that follows when people want miracles more than meaning. He never addressed the critics. Instead, he moved deeper into solitude. The cottage became a shell, the garden overgrown. Visitors turned away at the gate. He wrote fewer letters, spoke fewer words. And yet, those who visited said he was not broken, just changed. Softer, more still, as if the dream had settled into his bones, no longer something to share, only something to carry. And carry it he did, not as a leader, but as a man who had once believed the world could be transformed by asking the right question, and who now understood how fragile that belief truly was.
No headlines marked his passing. No memorials. No candlelight vigils. No tributes in polished halls. Just a simple bench under a sugar maple, and a neighbor who noticed the tea kettle had grown cold. Edward Ralston died the way he had lived those final years, in silence and without ceremony. They found a note, one line, handwritten, unaddressed. "The garden knows what to do without me." It was enough. He was buried quietly in a small plot beside a creek, no headstone at his request. No speeches, just earth. But the echo did not die, because belief, once planted, grows in unexpected places. In the months that followed, letters arrived to the post office that had been dormant for years. From strangers, from old followers, from people who had never met him, but who had found his words tucked in forgotten corners of the internet, quoted in anonymous blog posts, scribbled in the margins of second-hand books. They didn't write to mourn, they wrote to thank him for helping me speak to myself again, for reminding me I was still becoming, for teaching me that hope isn't silly, it's sacred. His name didn't appear in textbooks. He wasn't taught in psychology courses, but his influence threaded through the fabric of the quietly healing.
He left no foundation, no institute, no monument carved in stone. There is no museum dedicated to Edward Ralston. But if you know where to look, you can still find him. In a recovery group in Montana, where participants begin each session with a single whispered phrase, "I am not who the pain says I am." In a women's shelter in Dublin, where survivors paint portraits of their next selves, not the ones they escaped, but the ones they're becoming. In an old man's morning routine in Osaka, who sits by the window and says aloud to the dawn, "Today I will remember the part of me that once danced." None of them say his name. Most don't know it. But the echo of what he offered, that belief can be a medicine, that dreaming is a form of survival, still hums quietly in corners of the world that have never heard his lectures. The dream cure wasn't a formula. It wasn't even a cure. It was an invitation, a question wrapped in gentleness. What if you were not broken? What if you were just waiting for your own permission? Ralston gave no commandments, only mirrors, and mirrors, if offered with care, can change a life. He didn't ask to be remembered, but we remember him anyway, not as a man with all the answers, but as one who reminded us that we're allowed to ask better questions. Who would I be if I weren't afraid? What part of me have I been exiling all these years? Is it possible to believe before there's proof? In a world that tells us to be small, to be quiet, only to believe what we can measure, Edward Ralston told us, you can believe in more. And maybe that is the legacy, not a movement, not a method, but a moment, a breath, a whisper. You are still becoming. And the dream? It didn't die. It simply changed its name.